The crystal chandeliers swayed gently in the first-class dining saloon as passengers savored their final luncheon, silver cutlery catching the filtered sunlight that streamed through massive portholes. Children's laughter echoed from the promenade deck, where mothers clutched pearls against the Atlantic breeze, while stewards polished brass fittings that gleamed like gold against the ship's pristine white superstructure. Below decks, coal-blackened stokers fed the massive boilers with mechanical precision, their sweat-soaked bodies moving in rhythm to the ship's steady pulse. The acrid smell of coal smoke mingled with the salt air as passengers posed for photographs against the backdrop of the distant Irish coastline, unaware that a German torpedo was racing toward them at 40 knots. On May 7, 1915, the RMS Lusitania carried 1,159 souls into what they believed was the sanctuary of British waters. But was this tragedy an act of war or an orchestrated sacrifice? The German embassy's ominous advertisement appeared in New York newspapers on the morning of Lusitania's departure. Its stark black text warning passengers against sailing into British waters, where vessels flying the flag of Great Britain are liable to destruction. Captain William Turner dismissed the threats with characteristic British stoicism. Yet, beneath the veneer of routine confidence, crew members whispered of changed protocols and mysterious cargo manifests that bore little resemblance to peacetime sailings. The morning of May 1, 1915, dawned gray and cold over Manhattan's Hudson River piers, where the RMS Lusitania sat moored like a sleeping giant against Pier 54. Steam rose from her four massive funnels in ghostly wisps that dissipated into the overcast sky, while longshoremen hauled cargo up her gangways with mechanical efficiency that betrayed no hint of the international crisis brewing around them. The acrid smell of coal smoke mingled with the Hudson's brackish water and the exotic perfumes of first-class passengers who arrived in Rolls-Royce motor cars, their chauffeurs unloading Louis Vuitton trunks with practiced indifference to the diplomatic tensions crackling through the morning air. Inside the New York Times building, typesetters worked feverishly to compose the day's edition, their lead-stained fingers arranging metal letters that would carry news of European battlefields to American breakfast tables. Yet buried on page 8, between advertisements for Palmolive soap and Wanamaker's department store, appeared a notice that would chill readers who bothered to discover it. The Imperial German Embassy had purchased space to warn travelers that vessels flying British flags entered a war zone at their own peril, the formal diplomatic language barely concealing the threat of death that lurked beneath every carefully chosen word. Captain William Thomas Turner studied the warning from his cabin aboard the Lusitania, his weathered face betraying no emotions. He folded the newspaper with deliberate precision. At 58, Turner embodied the unflappable competence of the Cunard Line's senior commanders, his 35 years at sea having taught him to navigate through fog, storms, and icebergs with equal aplomb. The German submarine threat represented merely another hazard to be managed through seamanship and British naval superiority. Yet something in the warning's brazen audacity suggested a new ruthlessness in German strategy that transcended the gentlemanly conventions of 19th century warfare. Below decks, the ship's cargo holds received their final shipments under the supervision of customs officials, whose manifest books recorded a curious mixture of peacetime luxuries and wartime necessities. Cases of champagne and silk stockings shared space with copper ingots and aluminum sheets, while deeper in the hold, wooden crates marked as sporting goods concealed their true contents behind labels that would have horrified passengers sipping tea in the palm court above. The transformation of civilian vessels into auxiliary military transports represented one of the war's most morally ambiguous developments, blurring the distinction between combatants and non-combatants in ways that international law had never anticipated. The mathematics of impending disaster painted themselves across the Atlantic. 50 German U-boats prowled British waters. 6 ships had been torpedoed in the previous week. 1,959 passengers and crew aboard Lusitania remained unaware that 42,200,000 rifle cartridges lay hidden in their ship's cargo holds, while 3,240 empty shell casings destined for British factories occupied space once reserved for silk and champagne. These numbers represented more than statistics. They quantified the collision between industrial warfare's insatiable appetite for materiel and civilian shipping's vulnerability to submarines that recognized no distinction between military and merchant vessels. First Officer Arthur Rowland Jones supervised the loading operations with growing unease, his practiced eye noting discrepancies between the official cargo manifest and the actual contents being winched aboard. The wooden crates that descended into the forward holds bore shipping labels identifying them as cheese, butter, and oysters. Yet their weight and the careful handling they received suggested contents far more valuable than dairy products. When Jones questioned the ship's purser about the irregularities, he received only vague assurances that wartime shipping required certain discretionary measures that fell outside normal peacetime protocols. Passengers boarding the vessel remained blissfully ignorant of the deadly cargo traveling beneath their feet. Their attention focused instead on the ship's legendary luxury appointments and the promise of swift passage to Liverpool. The Lusitania's reputation as the floating palace of the Atlantic rested on amenities that rivaled the finest European: hotels, Ritz-Carlton restaurant service, telephones in first-class suites, and a gymnasium equipped with rowing machines and stationary bicycles. Yet the war had subtly transformed even these civilian comforts, as conversations in the smoking lounge increasingly turned to casualty reports from the Western Front and speculation about America's eventual entry into the European conflict. The German warning generated considerable discussion among passengers who gathered in the ship's ornate lounges to debate the likelihood of submarine attack. Many dismissed the threat as typical German bluster designed to discourage Atlantic commerce, pointing to the Royal Navy's supposed mastery of British coastal waters as insurance against enemy submarines. Others, however, noted the recent sinking of merchant vessels off the Irish coast and wondered whether the Kaiser's naval commanders possessed sufficient ruthlessness to torpedo a ship carrying American citizens. Strange phenomena had begun, manifesting aboard ships crossing the North Atlantic, as crew members reported unexplained mechanical failures, compass deviations, and radio interference that seemed to intensify as vessels approached British waters. Some attributed these anomalies to German electronic warfare capabilities that could disrupt navigation equipment from submerged submarines, while others suggested that the intense electromagnetic fields generated by underwater telegraph cables created interference patterns that affected sensitive instruments. The truth remained elusive, yet the consistency of reports across multiple vessels suggested either a coordinated German technological offensive or natural phenomena that mariners had never previously encountered. Turner conducted his final inspection of the ship as departure time approached, his experienced eye cataloging every detail that might affect the vessel's safety during the crossing ahead. The Lusitania represented the pinnacle of Edwardian marine engineering. Her 4 steam turbines capable of generating 68,000 horsepower and propelling her through the Atlantic at speeds that no submarine could match in sustained pursuit. Yet Turner understood that speed provided protection only in open ocean, where maneuverability and visibility gave surface vessels decisive advantages over submarines forced to attack while submerged and nearly blind. As the gangways were withdrawn and tugboats maneuvered the great liner away from her berth, Turner stood on his bridge, contemplating the voyage ahead with the fatalistic calm that characterized veteran sea captains. The German warning had been noted, evaluated, and filed away among the countless other hazards that attended Atlantic crossings in wartime. What he could not have known was that his ship carried within her holds the very weapons that her passengers' taxes and war bonds had purchased to kill German soldiers, transforming the Lusitania from an innocent civilian vessel into a legitimate military target whose destruction would serve German strategic interests while providing the Allies with a propaganda victory of incalculable value. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt adjusted his silk cravat in the mirror of his deluxe suite, while 3 decks below, Irish emigrants clutched their meager possessions in steerage quarters that reeked of carbolic acid and unwashed humanity. The ship's social stratification reflected an Edwardian world order already crumbling beneath the weight of mechanized warfare, yet passengers maintained the elaborate rituals of peacetime travel, even as German submarines stalked them through the submarine-infested waters of the western approaches. The morning sun streamed through the porthole of Vanderbilt's palatial accommodations on A deck, illuminating silk wallpaper that depicted pastoral English hunting scenes in delicate gold thread against emerald backgrounds. The multi-millionaire railroad heir occupied one of the ship's most prestigious suites, its mahogany furnishings and Persian carpets rivaling those of European palaces, where he had entertained royalty during happier times before the war. His valet pressed evening wear for the captain's dinner, while Vanderbilt contemplated the ivory-handled brushes arrayed on his dressing table, each piece engraved with his family crest and worth more than most passengers earned in a lifetime. 6 decks below, in the airless bowels of the ship, Margaret Guire pressed her infant son closer to her breast as the vessel's massive engines thrummed through the steel bulkheads with a rhythmic pounding that seemed to emanate from the ship's very soul. The Welsh woman had spent her life savings on steerage passage to New York, seeking opportunity in America's industrial cities, but the war had trapped her in a foreign land where work grew scarce, and anti-German hysteria made life dangerous for anyone with an accent that sounded remotely foreign. Now she clutched her return ticket like a talisman, praying that the Lusitania would carry her safely home to the green valleys of her childhood. The contrast between these worlds existed not merely in material comfort, but in the fundamental human experience of the crossing itself. First-class passengers enjoyed private bathrooms with hot and cold running water, electric lighting, and temperature-controlled ventilation that filtered the Atlantic air through silk screens imported from Lyon. They dined on 7-course meals prepared by chefs poached from London's finest hotels, their tables set with Wedgwood china and Waterford crystal that caught the light from ornate chandeliers suspended from coffered ceilings decorated with classical motifs. Between meals, they strolled the enclosed promenade decks or relaxed in leather armchairs within the ship's library, its shelves lined with first editions and current periodicals from both sides of the Atlantic. Steerage passengers, by contrast, shared communal washrooms where salt, water taps provided the only bathing facilities, their sleeping quarters arranged in narrow bunks that stacked human cargo with barely enough space to sit upright. The air in their compartments grew thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, seasickness, and the carbolic acid that stewards used to disinfect surfaces between voyages. Their meals consisted of boiled potatoes, thin soup, and coarse bread served on tin plates at long wooden tables that became slick with grease and spilled food as the ship rolled through Atlantic swells. Yet the war had begun to erode these traditional distinctions in ways that troubled the established order. Wealthy passengers spoke increasingly of sons killed in French trenches and fortunes lost to wartime taxation, while working-class families displayed a dignity born of sacrifice that commanded respect even from their social superiors. The Great Conflict had revealed that bullets and artillery shells recognized no difference between aristocratic blood and common clay, a democratic equality of death that challenged fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy and human worth. The social geography of impending catastrophe revealed itself in stark numerical terms. 290 first-class passengers occupied accommodations designed for comfort and safety. 600 second-class travelers enjoyed moderate amenities in the ship's middle sections, while 367 third-class passengers crowded into spaces below the waterline where escape routes remained limited and lifeboats seemed impossibly distant. These figures represented more than mere statistics. They quantified a social system where proximity to wealth determined proximity to survival, while 702 crew members served a passenger manifest that valued human life according to the price of their tickets. Strange disturbances had begun manifesting throughout the ship's social strata, as passengers reported unexplained phenomena that seemed to intensify as the vessel approached British waters. First-class passengers complained of electrical failures that plunged their luxurious suites into darkness without warning, while their expensive pocket watches stopped at seemingly random intervals despite having been wound religiously each morning. In steerage, mothers whispered of children who spoke in their sleep of drowning men and cold water, their nightmares so vivid that they woke screaming about events that had not yet occurred. Some attributed these anomalies to the ship's proximity to underwater magnetic fields generated by German submarine detection equipment, suggesting that enemy technology could influence both mechanical devices and human consciousness from considerable distances. Others proposed that the intense emotional stress of wartime travel created psychological conditions that manifested as shared hallucinations and mechanical failures caused by subconscious sabotage. The truth remained elusive, yet the consistency of reports across all classes suggested either unprecedented German technological capabilities or phenomena that transcended conventional understanding of cause and effect. The ship's social rituals continued despite these unsettling undercurrents, as passengers dressed for dinner with the same elaborate care their counterparts had observed during peacetime crossings. In the first-class dining saloon, women appeared in Worth gowns and family jewels that sparkled under electric chandeliers, while men wore white tie and tails that had been pressed to perfection by personal valets. The evening's conversation revolved around European politics and American business prospects, topics that allowed the wealthy to display their sophistication while avoiding direct reference to the carnage consuming European civilization. Below decks, steerage passengers gathered in their cramped quarters for impromptu concerts where Irish fiddles competed with Italian mandolins in musical battles that transcended linguistic barriers. Children played games with improvised toys while their parents shared stories of the lives they had left behind and the futures they hoped to claim in America or Europe. These informal gatherings possessed a warmth and authenticity that the elaborate first-class entertainments often lacked, revealing human connections that survived despite poverty and displacement. The war had transformed the very nature of Atlantic travel, introducing elements of danger and uncertainty that previous generations of passengers had never confronted. Peacetime crossings had represented leisurely interludes between continents, opportunities for wealthy travelers to conduct business deals or romantic liaisons while enjoying the finest accommodations that money could secure. Now every voyage carried the possibility of violent death, transforming luxury liners into floating targets where passenger lists became potential casualty reports and social distinctions dissolved in the face of shared mortality. As the Lusitania steamed eastward through increasingly dangerous waters, her passengers maintained the illusion of normalcy through elaborate social performances that masked growing anxiety about their ultimate destination. The ship's orchestras played ragtime melodies that drifted through ventilation systems into steerage compartments, creating a soundtrack of determined optimism that belied the reality of submarines and torpedoes that waited somewhere ahead in the gray Atlantic waters. Whether these rituals represented courage or denial remained unclear, yet they provided psychological armor against fears that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. The great vessel carried within her holds not merely cargo and passengers, but the entire social structure of a civilization that had not yet acknowledged its own mortality. From Vanderbilt's silk-lined suite to the crowded steerage berths where families huddled together for warmth and comfort, the Lusitania embodied both the achievements and contradictions of an era that had placed absolute faith in technological progress while remaining blind to technology's capacity for unprecedented destruction. Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger peered through the periscope of U-20 as the massive four-funneled liner materialized through the morning mist, her black hull cutting through the jade-green waters off the old head of Kinsale. The 29-year-old submarine commander had already sent 3 vessels to the bottom during this patrol, but never had he encountered such a magnificent target. A floating palace whose destruction would announce Germany's willingness to wage war without mercy against any vessel, military or civilian, that dared enter British waters. The cramped confines of U-20's control room reeked of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of salt water that seeped through hull plates stressed by days of submerged operations. Schwieger's crew had been at sea for 12 days, their submarine prowling the western approaches like a mechanical predator whose steel skin concealed 21 men, living in conditions that resembled a medieval dungeon more than a modern warship. The air grew fouler with each passing hour, thick with carbon dioxide, and the acrid smell of battery acid that burned their throats and made every breath a conscious effort to sustain life in an environment hostile to human survival. Through the periscope's narrow field of view, Schwieger watched the Lusitania approach with the stately majesty that had made her the pride of the Cunard line. Her 4 towering funnels released steady streams of coal smoke that stained the morning sky with industrial confidence, while her massive hull displaced thousands of tons of seawater with each forward surge through the Atlantic swells. The liner represented everything that German submarine warfare sought to destroy: British maritime supremacy, American commercial support for the Allied cause, and the illusion that civilian vessels could traverse war zones without consequence. The tactical situation crystallized in Schwieger's mind with the cold precision that had made him one of Germany's most effective submarine commanders. Wind and current would carry his torpedo true to its target, while the Lusitania's predictable course toward Queenstown Harbor eliminated the complex calculations usually required for long-range attacks against moving targets. The morning sun positioned itself behind his submarine, creating a natural blind spot that would conceal U-20's periscope from lookouts aboard the approaching liner until the moment of attack arrived. Schwieger had earned his reputation through methodical application of submarine warfare principles that treated enemy vessels as mathematical problems rather than repositories of human life. His previous commands had sent 43 Allied ships to the bottom, their destruction calculated in tonnage rather than lives lost, casualties reduced to statistical abstractions that facilitated the psychological distance necessary for effective killing. Yet the Lusitania presented a target whose symbolic value transcended mere tonnage, her destruction promising to deliver a psychological blow that would resonate far beyond the maritime casualties of conventional submarine warfare. The convergence of hunter and prey crystallized into precise nautical measurements. U-20 fired from 700 meters distance. The torpedo traveled at 40 knots toward a ship moving at 18 knots. Impact would occur at 14:10. Greenwich Mean Time on May 7, 1915, while 11 miles separated the Lusitania from the safety of Queenstown Harbor, a distance that might as well have been 11,000 miles. These numbers represented the mathematical poetry of destruction, coordinates and velocities that would transform a luxury liner into a maritime graveyard within minutes of their convergence. The submarine's crew moved through their battle stations with practiced efficiency, their movements choreographed by months of training that had transformed 21 individuals into components of a killing machine. The torpedo room crew prepared their deadly cargo with reverent attention to detail, checking firing mechanisms and guidance systems that would carry 300 pounds of high explosives across the intervening water toward an unsuspecting target. Each man understood his role in the approaching destruction, yet none could have anticipated the moral complexities that would follow their torpedo's inevitable detonation. Strange atmospheric phenomena had plagued submarine operations in these waters, as crews reported compass deviations, electrical failures, and acoustic anomalies that seemed to intensify near sites where previous sinkings had occurred. Some attributed these disturbances to underwater magnetic fields generated by sunken vessels whose steel hulls created electromagnetic interference patterns, while others suggested that the intense trauma of maritime disasters imprinted itself upon the surrounding environment in ways that science had yet to explain. The truth remained elusive, yet experienced submariners had learned to trust their instincts when familiar waters began behaving in unfamiliar ways. Schwieger's personal motivations reflected the complex psychology of submarine warfare, where individual conscience confronted military necessity in the claustrophobic isolation of underwater operations. The young commander had joined the Imperial Navy to serve his fatherland's maritime interests, yet the war had transformed him into an assassin whose weapon struck from concealment against victims who possessed no means of defense or retaliation. Each successful attack reinforced his reputation while eroding the moral foundations that had originally motivated his naval service, creating internal conflicts that manifested in increasingly erratic behavior among submarine crews. The Lusitania's approach triggered memories of peacetime, encounters with similar vessels when German naval officers had been welcomed aboard British liners as honored guests, participating in the international maritime community that transcended national boundaries. Schwieger himself had dined in first-class salons, identical to those now approaching within torpedo range, sharing wine and conversation with British officers who might now be serving aboard his intended target. These personal connections complicated the impersonal nature of submarine warfare, transforming anonymous enemies into potential acquaintances whose destruction required conscious suppression of human empathy. German naval strategy had evolved to embrace unrestricted submarine warfare as a weapon capable of breaking Britain's maritime lifeline to her overseas empire and American suppliers. Traditional naval combat had emphasized honorable engagement between armed opponents operating under internationally recognized rules of warfare, yet submarines represented a technological revolution that rendered such conventions obsolete. The underwater predators possessed decisive advantages over surface vessels only when operating from concealment, striking without warning against targets that could neither flee nor fight back effectively. The tactical doctrine that guided U-20's operations reflected Germany's strategic desperation as much as her technological innovation. British naval supremacy had effectively blockaded German ports, strangling her overseas trade and threatening her ability to sustain prolonged warfare against the Allied coalition. Submarine attacks against merchant shipping offered Germany's only realistic chance of achieving similar economic pressure against Britain. Yet the strategy required targeting civilian vessels whose destruction would inevitably provoke international outrage and potentially draw neutral nations into the war against Germany. Schwieger's final preparations proceeded with mechanical precision that masked the profound moral implications of his intended action. The torpedo that would soon streak toward the Lusitania carried within its warhead the power to transform hundreds of innocent passengers into casualties of a war they had played no role in creating. Children would die alongside their parents, while elderly passengers would find their final moments consumed by terror and confusion, rather than the peaceful conclusions to lives well lived. These human costs registered in Schwieger's consciousness as abstract necessities rather than personal tragedies, psychological compartmentalization that enabled effective military action while preserving individual sanity. As the moment of decision approached, the German commander faced choices that would define both his personal legacy and his nation's moral position in the emerging global conflict. The Lusitania represented far more than a military target. Her destruction would announce Germany's willingness to wage total war against any vessel that supported her enemies, regardless of the civilian casualties such tactics would inevitably produce. Whether this action constituted legitimate military necessity or criminal disregard for international law would be determined by historians whose judgments lay decades in the future. Yet the immediate consequences would reshape the war's trajectory within hours of the torpedo's detonation. The torpedo struck the starboard side between the first and second funnels with a thunderous explosion that shattered crystal, toppled passengers from their feet, and sent a geyser of seawater, debris, and human bodies high into the afternoon sky. Within seconds, a mysterious second explosion, far more powerful than the first, rocked the vessel from stem to stern, its origin a subject of speculation that would fuel conspiracy theories for more than a century, while the great ship began her final, fatal list to starboard. The moment of impact at 14:10, Greenwich Mean Time, transformed the Lusitania from a floating palace into a maritime catastrophe with the violent suddenness that characterized modern warfare's capacity for instantaneous destruction. The German torpedo, carrying 300 pounds of high explosives, penetrated the ship's hull plates like a steel fist punching through paper, its detonation creating a wound that measured 15 feet in diameter and extended below the waterline where the Atlantic Ocean began its relentless invasion of spaces designed to remain forever dry. The initial blast wave traveled through the ship's superstructure at the speed of sound, shattering windows throughout the vessel and creating a pressure pulse that burst eardrums and collapsed lungs among passengers standing near the point of impact. Margaret Guire felt the deck buckle beneath her feet in the third-class dining saloon, her infant son torn from her arms by the explosion's force, as tables and chairs became airborne projectiles that crashed into bulkheads with bone-crushing velocity. The Welsh mother watched in horror as the ship's elegant fixtures transformed into deadly weapons, crystal chandeliers plummeting from their moorings to explode against tilting floors where passengers struggled to comprehend the sudden transition from peaceful lunch to mortal peril. Around her, fellow steerage passengers screamed in languages she could not understand, yet their terror required no translation as the Lusitania began listing to starboard with ominous finality. Alfred Vanderbilt emerged from his suite to find a deck's magnificent corridor transformed into a nightmarish funhouse where Persian carpets had become treacherous slopes and mahogany paneling groaned under stresses that threatened structural collapse. The millionaire's silk-lined world had vanished in seconds, replaced by a reality where wealth provided no protection against the democratic equality of maritime disaster. Water began seeping through the ship's wounded hull, its icy touch carrying the promise of death that recognized no distinction between first-class privilege and steerage poverty. The second explosion erupted from deep within the ship's bowels with a violence that dwarfed the torpedo's initial impact, its origins mysterious and terrifying to passengers who felt the great vessel shudder as if struck by the fist of an angry god. Steam and smoke billowed from ventilation shafts while the lights flickered and died, plunging interior compartments into darkness that amplified the sounds of rending metal and human anguish. The blast's source would remain contentious for decades, with maritime experts debating whether coal dust, boiler explosions, or hidden munitions had created the secondary detonation that sealed the Lusitania's fate. Survivors described the second explosion as emanating from deep within the ship's bowels, accompanied by a sound like the roaring of a great beast that seemed to rise from hell itself to claim the vessel for its own purposes. Maritime experts suggest the blast resulted from coal dust ignition in the ship's bunkers, where fine particles suspended in air could create explosive mixtures that required only a spark to detonate with devastating force. Yet others maintain that hidden munitions cargo provided the secondary explosion's fury, a theory that transforms innocent passengers into unwitting accomplices in their own destruction, while suggesting that the Lusitania carried the seeds of her doom in her cargo holds. The mathematical precision of catastrophe revealed itself in measurements that quantified the unthinkable. 18 minutes from torpedo impact to final submersion, 15-degree starboard list within 5 minutes that rendered portside lifeboats unusable, 2 explosions separated by 30 seconds that created 3 separate breach points below the waterline, while 35,000 tons of seawater flooded compartments designed to remain watertight under all circumstances, except the one now consuming the great ship. Captain Turner rushed to his bridge through corridors where emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on bulkheads that groaned under unprecedented stresses, his trained eye immediately recognizing the terminal nature of his ship's wounds. The Lusitania's list increased with each passing minute as thousands of tons of Atlantic seawater poured through torpedo damage that exceeded the vessel's compartmentalization capabilities. Her fate sealed by engineering realities that no amount of seamanship could overcome. Turner's commands echoed through speaking tubes that carried his voice to crew members struggling to maintain order amid chaos that defied all previous maritime experience. The ship's magnificent public spaces became death traps where elegant furnishings transformed into instruments of destruction. In the first-class lounge, Grand pianos broke loose from their moorings to slide across tilting floors like massive battering rams, crushing passengers who could not escape their path. Crystal chandeliers swayed violently before crashing down in explosions of shattered glass that lacerated anyone within reach, while marble columns cracked under stresses that threatened to bring entire deck structures down upon the heads of trapped passengers. Steerage compartments below the waterline became flooded tombs where families found themselves trapped by twisted metal and rising water that offered no hope of escape. The ship's design had prioritized first-class safety over third-class survival, concentrating lifeboats and emergency exits in areas accessible to wealthy passengers while leaving immigrant families to navigate maze-like passages that filled with seawater faster than human beings could traverse them. These engineering choices reflected social priorities that became matters of life and death when the Lusitania began her final plunge toward the ocean floor. Strange phenomena accompanied the vessel's death throes, as passengers reported seeing ghostly figures moving through smoke-filled corridors while ethereal music seemed to drift from spaces where no musicians could possibly survive. Some attributed these apparitions to oxygen deprivation and psychological trauma that created hallucinations indistinguishable from supernatural manifestations, while others insisted that the intensity of approaching death had somehow torn the veil between physical and spiritual realms. The truth remained elusive, yet multiple witnesses described encounters that transcended rational explanation during those final minutes when the boundary between life and death seemed temporarily suspended. The torpedo's impact had created a cascade of failures that doomed the Lusitania through the inexorable logic of physics and engineering limitations. Compartments designed to contain flooding became overwhelmed by damage that exceeded their structural capabilities, while the ship's electrical systems failed in sequences that left passengers trapped in darkness where familiar spaces became alien landscapes of terror and confusion. Emergency procedures developed for peacetime accidents proved inadequate for wartime destruction that created conditions beyond the imagination of maritime safety experts. Water continued pouring through the torpedo breach with the relentless determination of natural forces that recognized no human authority or technological pretension. The Atlantic Ocean reclaimed spaces that had been temporarily borrowed from its domain, filling elegant staterooms and dining salons with the same indifferent efficiency it displayed when washing over empty beaches. Passengers who had viewed the ocean as a highway between continents now confronted its reality as an alien environment where human life could survive only through artificial protection that German torpedoes had permanently destroyed. The great ship's list increased beyond the critical angle where recovery became impossible, her fate sealed by mathematical relationships between displacement, flooding, and structural integrity that brooked no negotiation or mercy. Passengers who had boarded as travelers found themselves transformed into shipwreck victims whose survival depended upon reaching lifeboats before the Lusitania completed her final journey to the Atlantic floor. The democratic nature of maritime disaster had begun asserting itself with pitiless equality, erasing social distinctions in the face of physical laws that governed floating objects with perfect impartiality. As the second explosion's echoes faded into the groaning of tortured metal and the rising chorus of human voices calling for help that might never arrive, the RMS Lusitania began her transformation from symbol of technological achievement into maritime grave marker, whose location would be measured in fathoms rather than deck plans. Her passengers' fates now subject to the merciless arbitration of cold water and insufficient lifeboats. Captain Turner stood on his bridge, watching, helplessly as his command, once the fastest passenger liner on the Atlantic, transformed into a death trap where lifeboats crashed into the sea, crushing passengers who had leaped overboard in desperation. The ship's severe starboard list made launching boats on the port side nearly impossible, while those on the starboard side swung inward against the hull, creating a maritime nightmare where the very instruments of salvation became agents of destruction. The bridge wing offered Turner a panoramic view of catastrophe, unfolding with mechanical precision across his vessel's tilting decks, where passengers who had moments before been enjoying afternoon tea now fought for access to lifeboats that represented their only hope of surviving the next 18 minutes. The captain's weathered hands gripped the bridge rail as he watched scenes that would haunt his memory, until death claimed him 15 years later, his professional composure cracking under the weight of responsibility for lives that slipped beyond his power to protect. Below him, the elegant promenade decks had become killing fields where panic transformed civilized passengers into desperate animals clawing toward salvation that retreated with each degree of the ship's fatal list. The Lusitania's portside lifeboats hung useless in their davits, the ship's 15-degree list pulling them inward against the superstructure, where they could not be lowered without smashing into the very vessel they were meant to evacuate. Chief Officer William Piper struggled with boat number 14, his crew hauling desperately on tackle that refused to function properly as the listing deck created angles that rendered standard lifeboat procedures impossible. Women and children crowded around the boat stations, their faces reflecting the growing realization that salvation dangled tantalizingly close, yet remained functionally unreachable due to engineering failures that peacetime drills had never anticipated. On the Teodzeu's starboard side, where the ship's list should have facilitated lifeboat launching, a different horror unfolded as boats swung away from the ship's side, only to crash back against the hull with crushing force. Lifeboat number 1 descended smoothly until the vessel's continued listing caused it to pendulum back toward the Lusitania's steel plates, smashing its occupants against riveted metal with sickening impacts that echoed across the water. Passengers who had achieved the safety of the boats found themselves victims of physics and engineering limitations that transformed escape vehicles into instruments of death more efficient than drowning. The starboard boats that successfully reached the water often capsized immediately upon impact. Their occupants spilled into the Atlantic's frigid embrace, where hypothermia began its deadly work within minutes of immersion. Those passengers who managed to cling to overturned hulls faced a different form of death sentence, their bodies losing core temperature at rates that would render them unconscious long before rescue vessels could reach the scene. The ocean's temperature measured 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill healthy adults within 30 minutes, while children and elderly passengers faced even shorter survival times in water that leached life from human bodies with methodical efficiency. The arithmetic of disaster accelerated beyond human comprehension. 18 minutes from torpedo impact to final submersion, 15-degree starboard list that rendered 11 of 22 lifeboats unusable, 6 lifeboats launched successfully, while 764 passengers and crew would perish in waters measuring 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill within 30 minutes. These numbers represented more than statistical abstractions. They quantified the collision between human engineering and natural forces that recognized no distinction between technological achievement and maritime hubris. Alfred Vanderbilt moved through the chaos with aristocratic calm that seemed almost supernatural amid the surrounding panic, his breeding asserting itself even as death approached with inexorable certainty. The railroad air assisted women and children toward lifeboats with the same courtesy he had displayed in Manhattan drawing rooms. his silk evening clothes growing sodden with spray from boats that crashed against the ship's side in their futile attempts at evacuation. Vanderbilt's valet stood beside his master with loyalty that transcended employment contracts, both men facing death with dignity that elevated them above the surrounding chaos while highlighting the arbitrary nature of survival in maritime disasters. Margaret Guire clutched her infant son while fighting through crowds that pressed toward lifeboat stations with desperate urgency, her Welsh accent lost amid a babble of languages that reflected the Lusitania's international passenger manifest. The mother's maternal instincts warred with rational assessment of survival odds that favored neither sentiment nor hope, yet she continued struggling toward boats that might already be beyond reach. Around her, families separated in the chaos called out names that would never receive answers, their voices joining a chorus of human anguish that rose above the sounds of rending metal and crashing lifeboats. Strange acoustic phenomena accompanied the ship's death throes, as passengers reported hearing impossible sounds that seemed to emanate from the vessel herself. Groaning voices that spoke in languages no living person recognized, accompanied by what survivors described as ethereal music that played melodies of profound sadness. Some attributed these auditory hallucinations to the psychological trauma of approaching death, combined with the ship's hull plates vibrating under unprecedented stress, creating harmonic frequencies that the human brain interpreted as supernatural communication. Others insisted that the Lusitania herself had achieved consciousness in her final moments, her dying voice reaching out to passengers who would soon join her in the Atlantic's depths. The ship's crew struggled to maintain emergency procedures that had never been designed for wartime conditions, where torpedo damage created cascading failures throughout multiple systems simultaneously. Chief Purser Hugh Johnston moved through tilting corridors, attempting to coordinate evacuation efforts, while emergency lighting cast hellish shadows that transformed familiar spaces into alien landscapes where death waited behind every twisted bulkhead. The crew's training emphasized orderly evacuation procedures that assumed sufficient time and stable platforms for lifeboat launching, assumptions that German torpedoes had rendered obsolete within seconds of impact. First Officer Jones coordinated lifeboat operations from the boat deck, where he watched his careful peacetime drills dissolve into chaos that mocked decades of maritime safety evolution. The regulations that governed passenger ship construction and operation had emerged from previous disasters where structural damage developed gradually, allowing crews time to implement emergency procedures in systematic fashion. The Lusitania's rapid deterioration compressed evacuation timelines beyond the limits of human organization, creating situations where training and experience provided little advantage over panic and desperate improvisation. Water continued rising through the ship's interior spaces with relentless determination that transformed elegant public rooms into flooded caverns where furniture floated like debris from some underwater civilization. The ship's magnificent grand staircase became a waterfall, as Atlantic seawater cascaded down mahogany steps that had welcomed passengers to luxury accommodations, their descent now leading only to death. Electric lights flickered and died as saltwater reached generator rooms, plunging interior compartments into darkness that amplified the sounds of human terror and mechanical destruction. The Lusitania's list increased beyond the critical angle where stability became impossible to maintain, her massive hull responding to the inexorable laws of physics that governed floating objects regardless of human intentions or engineering pretensions. The great ship had crossed the point of no return, her fate sealed by mathematical relationships between displacement and flooding that admitted no appeal to human authority or technological achievement. Passengers who remained aboard faced the choice between immediate death in failed lifeboats or delayed death in the frigid Atlantic waters that would claim them regardless of their decision. Turner issued his final commands through speaking tubes that carried his voice to engine rooms where stokers maintained steam pressure until the rising water reached boiler rooms and transformed superheated metal into explosive fragments that added to the chaos consuming his vessel. The captain's duty required him to remain aboard until evacuation was complete, yet the Lusitania's rapid sinking made such noble gestures, meaningless gestures, that served honor rather than practical purpose. His ship was dying faster than human evacuation could proceed, her technological sophistication proving useless against damage that exceeded all design parameters. Emergency flares burst over the sinking liner like premature funeral pyres, their red light illuminating scenes of maritime horror that would be etched into survivor memories for the remainder of their lives. The distress signals climbed high into the afternoon sky before falling back toward the ocean as burning stars that seemed to mourn the great ship's passing, while calling desperately for rescue vessels that might arrive too late to save more than a fraction of those now facing death in the cold Atlantic waters off the Irish coast. The RMS Lusitania disappeared beneath the waves bow first in a maelstrom of steam, smoke, and human agony that witnesses described as resembling the gates of hell opening upon the surface of the Atlantic. Survivors clinging to debris watched the 4 massive funnels vanish one by one beneath the green water, while the screams of the drowning created a symphony of suffering that would haunt their memories until their own deaths decades later. The great ship's final plunge began at 1428, Greenwich Mean Time, as her bow dipped beneath the surface with gathering momentum that transformed the Lusitania from a wounded vessel into a diving projectile, aimed at the ocean floor 300 feet below. Water cascaded through open portholes and companionways with the sound of Niagara Falls compressed into a maritime death scene, while air trapped within the hull created explosive releases that sent geysers of foam and debris high into the afternoon sky. The vessel's 4 towering funnels, once symbols of technological achievement and British maritime supremacy, now marked the grave of industrial civilization's confidence in its own invincibility. Margaret Guire found herself in the frigid Atlantic, clutching her infant son against her breast, while oil-slicked water filled her mouth with the taste of death and industrial lubricants that had leaked from the dying ship's machinery. The Welsh mother treaded water that felt like liquid ice, her wool dress becoming a sodden shroud that dragged her toward the depths where her son's father waited among the countless dead who had preceded them into the ocean's embrace. Around her, fellow passengers called out in languages that desperation had reduced to universal pleas for help that would never arrive, their voices growing weaker as hypothermia claimed their ability to maintain consciousness in water that measured barely above freezing. The Lusitania's final moments created a vortex that pulled swimmers and debris toward her sinking hull with irresistible force, the vessel's displacement creating underwater currents that transformed the surrounding ocean into a killing field where survival required distance from the very ship that had promised safe passage. Passengers who had jumped from her decks found themselves drawn back toward destruction by physics that recognized no distinction between human life and floating wreckage. The sea claiming victims through drowning, hypothermia, and the crushing forces generated by a 32,000-ton vessel accelerating toward the bottom. Alfred Vanderbilt disappeared beneath the surface without apparent struggle, his aristocratic bearing maintained even as death claimed him in the democratic embrace of salt water that recognized no difference between railroad millions and steerage poverty. Witnesses reported seeing the millionaire's silk hat floating among the debris field like a funeral flower, marking the spot where privilege had finally encountered an adversary that could not be purchased, negotiated with, or appealed to through social connections. His body would never be recovered, leaving only the memory of a man who had faced death with the same composure he had displayed while entertaining European royalty in happier times before the war. The mathematical finality of maritime catastrophe revealed itself in measurements that quantified the unthinkable. 18 minutes and 30 seconds from torpedo impact to final disappearance. 1,198 souls lost to water, measuring 55 degrees Fahrenheit. 761 survivors pulled from debris fields that extended across 2 square miles of Atlantic Ocean, while the wreck settled at a depth of 295 feet on the ocean floor, 11 miles from the safety of Queenstown Harbor. These numbers represented more than statistical abstractions. They measured the distance between technological hubris and natural forces that admitted no appeal to human engineering or social distinction. Multiple survivors reported seeing ghostly figures walking on the water near the sinking ship, their forms appearing translucent, yet clearly human as they moved across the waves with purposeful determination that defied both physics and rational explanation. Some witnesses described recognizing these apparitions as passengers who had already drowned, while others claimed the figures beckoned to struggling swimmers as if guiding them toward rescue or offering comfort in their final moments. Hypothermia-induced hallucinations provide a medical explanation for these visions, as oxygen-deprived brains often create compelling visual experiences that seem indistinguishable from reality. Yet the consistency of accounts across dozens of witnesses suggests either mass psychological phenomena or manifestations that transcended conventional understanding of death and consciousness. The ocean around the sinking liner became a hellscape of human suffering, where survivors clung to deck chairs, life preservers, and floating corpses with equal desperation, while the Atlantic's relentless cold leached warmth from bodies that had never been designed to survive immersion in subarctic conditions. Children died first, their smaller bodies unable to generate sufficient heat to maintain consciousness in water that killed healthy adults within 30 minutes of exposure. Elderly passengers succumbed almost as quickly, their aged circulatory systems failing to deliver oxygenated blood to vital organs that shut down in systematic progression from extremities toward the heart. Strange phenomena accompanied the vessel's disappearance, as witnesses reported hearing ethereal music drifting across the water long after the ship's orchestra had vanished beneath the waves. Melodies that seemed to rise from the depths themselves in harmonies no human composer had ever written. Some attributed these auditory experiences to wind patterns across the debris field, creating harmonic frequencies that the traumatized brain interpreted as supernatural music, while others insisted that the intensity of mass death had somehow imprinted musical memories upon the surrounding environment in ways that science could not explain. The truth remained elusive, yet multiple survivors described hearing impossible symphonies that provided comfort during their darkest moments while awaiting rescue that might never arrive. Rescue vessels approaching the disaster site encountered a maritime graveyard that stretched across miles of ocean surface, where human bodies floated among deck furniture and personal belongings that told the story of interrupted lives now claimed by the Atlantic's indifferent embrace. The steamship Wanderer arrived first on the scene, her crew hauling aboard survivors whose eyes reflected horrors that would never entirely fade from memory. Captain William Wood directed rescue operations that transformed his cargo vessel into a floating hospital where the living and dying lay side by side on improvised stretchers fashioned from ship's canvas and cargo netting. The debris field revealed the violent nature of the Lusitania's destruction through artifacts that bobbed on the swells like relics from a civilization that had valued luxury over safety and technological achievement over human wisdom. First-class dinner services floated alongside steerage cooking pots, their social distinctions erased by salt water that recognized no hierarchy among the possessions of the dead. Children's toys drifted past life preservers that had failed to preserve life, while leather-bound books opened their pages to an ocean that could not read the stories of interrupted dreams and abandoned ambitions they contained. The sinking transformed survivors into witnesses whose testimonies would fuel international outrage and diplomatic crises that reshaped the war's trajectory toward American intervention. Those who lived through the 18 minutes of terror carried within their memories the sound of 1,200 people dying simultaneously, a chorus of human anguish that rose above the ocean's surface, like prayers directed toward a heaven that seemed to have abandoned the North Atlantic to forces beyond divine intervention. Their accounts would become historical documents that chronicled not merely a maritime disaster, but the death of an era that had believed technology could triumph over nature and civilization, over the barbarism of total war. As rescue vessels continued pulling survivors from water that grew calmer as afternoon turned toward evening, the final bubbles rose from the Lusitania's grave to mark the spot where British maritime supremacy had suffered a wound that would never fully heal. The great ship rested on the ocean floor with her bow buried in Atlantic mud and her stern pointing toward the surface like an accusatory finger raised against the German submarine that had condemned her passengers to death by drowning, hypothermia, and the crushing realization that modern warfare recognized no distinction between combatants and civilians. The sea had claimed its prize with the methodical efficiency that characterized all natural forces when confronting human pretension. Yet the Lusitania's destruction represented more than mere maritime tragedy. It marked the moment when the civilized world discovered that technology's capacity for destruction had outpaced humanity's wisdom in controlling the forces it had unleashed upon itself in pursuit of national advantage and military victory. The wireless distress calls that crackled across the Atlantic on that May afternoon carried more than news of maritime disaster. They transmitted the death knell of American neutrality and the birth cry of a propaganda war that would ultimately drag the United States into the European conflagration. President Woodrow Wilson faced a crisis that would test his commitment to peace against the rising tide of public outrage over German submarine warfare's callous disregard for civilian life. The Marconi wireless station at Clifton, Ireland, received the first fragmented transmissions from rescue vessels approaching the Lusitania's final position, their operators struggling to decode messages that seemed to describe scenes beyond the boundaries of civilized warfare. The static-filled reports spoke of hundreds of bodies floating in oil-slicked water, while survivors clung to debris that bore the Cunard line's distinctive markings, transforming a routine shipping disaster into an international incident that would reverberate through diplomatic chancelleries from Washington to Berlin. The telegraph keys that tapped out these initial reports struck with mechanical precision that belied the human catastrophe they documented. each dot and dash carrying implications that would reshape global alliances and military strategies for years to come. President Wilson received news of the sinking in the White House study, where he had been drafting correspondence about Mexican border disputes. The domestic crisis suddenly rendered insignificant by events, unfolding 3,000 miles away in waters that had become a graveyard for American citizens. The president's scholarly demeanor masked emotional turmoil as he contemplated response options that ranged from diplomatic protest to declarations of war that would transform the United States from neutral observer to active belligerent in Europe's self-destructive conflict. Wilson's commitment to keeping America out of European entanglements faced its greatest test in the form of 1,198 corpses floating in the North Atlantic, their silent testimony more powerful than any political rhetoric about national honor or international law. The German embassy in Washington maintained official silence while its staff monitored American newspaper reports that grew increasingly inflammatory with each edition. Headlines demanding vengeance against the Kaiser's submarine commanders, who had torpedoed women and children without warning or mercy. Ambassador Johann von Bernstorff faced the impossible task of defending actions that even German naval officers privately questioned, his diplomatic skills tested by public outrage that transcended party politics and regional differences to unite Americans in condemnation of submarine warfare tactics that violated fundamental assumptions about civilized conflict. British propaganda machinery seized upon the Lusitania's destruction with sophisticated efficiency that transformed maritime tragedy into recruiting poster imagery. Artists creating illustrations that depicted German submarines as sea monsters preying upon innocent civilians, while their commanders laughed at the drowning victims. These visual narratives simplified complex military strategies into moral absolutes that portrayed the war as a struggle between civilization and barbarism, democracy and autocracy, Christian mercy and Teutonic brutality. The dead passengers became martyrs whose sacrifice demanded vengeance from nations that had previously maintained neutrality in what they had considered a European civil war. The political mathematics of tragedy reshaped international relations with brutal clarity. 1,198 dead, including 128 American citizens. 3 diplomatic notes exchanged between Washington and Berlin over 4 months. 23 months would pass before the United States declared war on Germany, while 2 years of American neutrality died in the North Atlantic, along with the passengers of the Lusitania, a neutrality that 4,000 American doughboys would ultimately pay to restore with their blood on European battlefields. These numbers represented more than statistical records. They quantified the transformation of public opinion from isolationist indifference to interventionist determination that would culminate in American military involvement on a scale that no one had imagined possible before German torpedoes created American martyrs. Strange coincidences surrounded the disaster's timing and circumstances, as intelligence documents revealed that British naval authorities had withdrawn destroyer escorts from the area while simultaneously receiving German wireless transmissions that indicated submarine activity along the very route the Lusitania would traverse. Some investigators attributed these phenomena to bureaucratic incompetence and communication failures that plagued all military organizations during wartime operations, while conspiracy theorists suggested that Winston Churchill and other British officials deliberately sacrificed the liner to create an incident that would bring America into the war against Germany. The evidence remained ambiguous, yet the convenient timing of events continued to fuel speculation about whether the passengers died as victims of German aggression or pawns in a larger strategic game that treated human lives as acceptable losses in the pursuit of military alliance. Congressional debates in Washington reflected American society's struggle to reconcile traditional isolationism with moral outrage over German submarine tactics that seemed to violate fundamental principles of international law and Christian civilization. Senators who had previously opposed military preparedness programs now demanded naval construction that would enable the United States to project power across the Atlantic, while representatives from German-American districts faced constituent pressure that forced them to choose between ethnic loyalty and national identity. The Lusitania's destruction had fractured America's ethnic coalitions along lines that reflected European battle lines, transforming domestic politics into extensions of foreign conflicts that most Americans had hoped to avoid. Wilson's response combined moral condemnation with diplomatic restraint. His carefully crafted notes to Berlin demanding guarantees that German submarine commanders would provide warning and safe passage for passengers before attacking vessels in war zones. The president's legalistic approach reflected his academic background and personal commitment to peaceful resolution of international disputes. Yet public pressure for military action grew stronger with each German submarine attack that claimed additional American lives. Wilson found himself trapped between constitutional obligations to protect American citizens and campaign promises to keep the nation out of European wars that seemed to offer no clear path to victory or moral vindication. The German government faced equally difficult choices as Kaiser Wilhelm II and his advisors debated whether to continue unrestricted submarine warfare that promised to strangle British commerce while risking American intervention that could prove decisive in determining the war's outcome. Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg advocated diplomatic accommodation with Washington to prevent American entry into the conflict, while Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz argued that submarine warfare represented Germany's only hope of achieving victory before American industrial capacity could tip the balance irreversibly against the Central Powers. The Lusitania's passengers had died in service of strategic calculations that reduced human lives to variables in mathematical equations designed to optimize military effectiveness. International law struggled to address warfare technologies that had developed faster than diplomatic protocols, creating legal vacuums where submarine commanders operated without clear guidance about legitimate targets and acceptable tactics. The Hague Conventions had established principles for surface naval warfare that assumed combat between armed vessels whose crews could engage in honorable battle according to established traditions. Yet, submarines represented revolutionary weapons that achieved effectiveness through stealth and surprise attacks against targets that possessed no means of defense or retaliation. The Lusitania's destruction highlighted the inadequacy of international legal frameworks that had been designed for an era of warfare that German U-boats had rendered obsolete. American newspaper coverage reflected regional and ethnic divisions that complicated efforts to forge national consensus about appropriate responses to German submarine warfare. Eastern publications with strong ties to British commerce demanded immediate military action, while Midwest papers serving German-American communities urged diplomatic solutions that would preserve neutrality and avoid entanglement in European conflicts. Southern newspapers focused on economic implications of disrupted Atlantic trade, while Western publications seemed more concerned with Mexican border disputes than European maritime disasters that seemed geographically and culturally distant from American interests. The sinking's anniversary would become a focal point for memorial services and political rallies that kept public attention focused on German submarine warfare's human costs, ensuring that the Lusitania's passengers remained visible symbols of civilian victimization long after their bodies had been committed to Atlantic graves. These commemorative events served multiple political purposes, from recruiting rallies that transformed maritime tragedy into military inspiration, to peace demonstrations that portrayed the dead passengers as victims of warmongering policies that sacrificed innocent lives for imperial ambitions. The 1,098 victims had become contested symbols whose memory served opposing political agendas that reflected America's fundamental disagreement about its proper role in global conflicts. As diplomatic correspondence accumulated between Washington, London, and Berlin throughout the summer and autumn of 1915, the Lusitania's ghost haunted every negotiation and influenced every strategic calculation that brought the United States closer to military intervention in the European War. The great ship's destruction had created moral imperatives that transcended traditional isolationist policies, establishing precedents for American involvement in conflicts that threatened democratic values and civilian populations, regardless of their geographic proximity to North American interests. The passengers who had died in 18 minutes of terror off the Irish coast had purchased with their lives a transformation of American foreign policy that would reshape global power relationships for the remainder of the 20th century.